It began as a quiet spring evening in the upscale neighborhood of Brookhaven, just outside Atlanta. The air was warm, scented with freshly cut grass and the faint perfume of blooming magnolias. Neighbors recalled how still the night was, until the sound of distant sirens shattered that calm forever. When police arrived at the scene, they found 42-year-old David Miller, a successful financial consultant and father of two, lying motionless in his backyard, surrounded by traces of a violent struggle. His body was covered in multiple stab wounds, his shirt soaked in blood. At first glance, it looked like a burglary gone wrong. The back door had been left ajar, a few drawers were open, and a lamp lay shattered on the floor. But something about the scene didn't sit right with Detective Aaron Wallace, the lead investigator. Nothing valuable was missing, not the expensive watches, not the electronics, not even the wallet still in David's pocket. Whoever had done this hadn't come for money. They had come for him. David Miller's life, by all appearances, was the portrait of success. He was well known in Brookhaven for his thriving financial firm and his involvement in community projects. His wife, Rebecca Miller, 38, was a respected real estate agent and often described as the perfect suburban mom, elegant, charming, always smiling at church events and neighborhood gatherings. Together, they raised two children, Emily, 10, and Ryan, 7. Friends called them the couple everyone admired, the ones who had it all. But behind the closed doors of their immaculate two-story home, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. David's work kept him busy late into the evenings, and Rebecca had grown increasingly distant over the past year. Their once loving marriage had turned cold, filled with polite silences and separate routines. David spent more nights at the office, while Rebecca found new reasons to be away: gym sessions, open houses, client dinners that seemed to last longer and longer. Neighbors would later tell police that in recent months, Rebecca had seemed different. Restless. Distracted. Sometimes they saw her stepping out of a sleek black car that wasn't hers, the driver a tall, athletic man no one recognized. That man was Daniel Ross, a 34-year-old personal trainer with a checkered past. Daniel had been hired by Rebecca at a private fitness club nearly a year earlier. What began as casual workouts soon evolved into private training sessions at the Millers' home gym while David was away. He was charming, confident, and had the kind of intensity that drew people in. Rebecca, feeling neglected and lonely, was vulnerable, and Daniel knew exactly how to exploit that. By late summer, their professional relationship had crossed a dangerous line. What began as flirtation quickly became an affair, passionate, secretive, and reckless. To friends, Rebecca's renewed energy seemed like a sign of happiness. But in truth, it was the thrill of deception. She and Daniel met in secluded parks, motels off the highway, and occasionally at the Miller home when David was working late. They used burner phones to communicate, always deleting their messages, convinced they were being careful. But their affair wasn't just about desire. It became about power and greed. David had recently taken out a $2 million life insurance policy. Rebecca, aware of every financial detail, had mentioned it to Daniel one evening over drinks. If something ever happened to him, she joked, the kids and I would be set for life. That passing comment became the seed of a deadly idea. Daniel's eyes lit up. What if that wasn't just a joke, he asked, half laughing. At first, Rebecca brushed it off. But over the following weeks, the idea took root in her mind. She began to see David not as her husband, but as a barrier, the obstacle standing between her and a new life with Daniel. Together, they began to fantasize about a future built on money and freedom. By winter, the fantasy had become a plan. They bought prepaid phones, used a GPS tracker to monitor David's movements, and studied his schedule down to the minute. Daniel even followed him once, noting how David often came home late, usually alone. The plan was simple: make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. It would be quick, clean, and profitable. Or so they thought. On the night of the murder, everything was set in motion. David had stayed late at the office, reviewing quarterly reports. Rebecca had arranged to take the kids to her sister's for the weekend, a convenient alibi. Daniel waited in a rented car near the house, gloves on, knife in hand. At 10:17 p.m., David arrived home. The motion lights flicked on as he parked in the driveway. Moments later, a figure emerged from the shadows. The struggle was violent but brief. David didn't stand a chance. As Daniel fled into the night, blood dripping onto the grass, the backyard fell silent once more. Inside, the house remained untouched, except for the man lying lifeless beneath the stars. But the killers had made one fatal mistake. A neighbor's security camera, positioned across the street, caught the reflection of headlights leaving the Miller home just minutes after David's estimated time of death. The car was a dark blue luxury coupe, the same model Daniel Ross drove. Detective Wallace didn't know it yet, but that image would become the thread that unraveled everything. Detective Aaron Wallace stood at the edge of the Miller property as dawn broke, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood. The sun's first rays touched the dew-soaked grass where blood had dried dark overnight. Birds chirped softly in the distance, unaware that just hours earlier, this manicured backyard had become a scene of unimaginable violence. Inside, crime scene technicians moved methodically through the house. The interior was spotless, almost too spotless. No signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no missing valuables. The only disturbance was a faint trail of blood near the sliding glass door that led outside, where David Miller had taken his final steps. It was clear, whoever killed him knew exactly when and how to strike. Detective Wallace began her interviews that morning. Rebecca Miller had returned from her sister's home after receiving the devastating call. She arrived wearing dark sunglasses, her expression pale but poised, the kind of controlled grief that felt rehearsed. "I just don't understand," she whispered to the detective, her voice trembling. "Who would do something like this? David never hurt anyone." Wallace watched her closely. The tears came, but they were selective, calculated. "We'll find out, Mrs. Miller," the detective said calmly. "Can you walk me through your weekend? Every detail might help." Rebecca recited her timeline flawlessly. She'd left Friday afternoon to visit her sister in Macon with her children, returning Sunday morning. She said David had planned to work late Friday and possibly host a client meeting at home afterward. Everything sounded perfect. Too perfect. When asked about David's recent mood, Rebecca hesitated. "He'd been distracted lately. Work stress, I guess. He barely slept." Wallace took note of every pause, every glance away. In her years on the force, she'd learned that guilt often hid behind grief. Later that day, the detective examined the exterior footage from surrounding homes. One camera, belonging to an elderly neighbor across the street, captured something crucial. At 10:24 p.m., just minutes after the coroner's estimated time of death, a dark blue coupe sped away from the Miller's driveway without headlights. Rebecca had said David's car was silver. So whose was this? Wallace ordered a canvass of the area, and within 24 hours, her team identified the make and model, a Lexus RCF, expensive. Sleek. Rare in that neighborhood. The license plate wasn't clear, but it gave them a starting point. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's report came in. David had been stabbed 6 times, 3 to the chest, 2 to the abdomen, 1 to the neck. The wounds were clean, deliberate. No defensive injuries. That meant he'd either been attacked from behind, or he'd known his killer. The killer hadn't come to rob him. They'd come to end him. By midweek, the case took an unexpected turn. Detective Wallace received a call from David's business partner, Mark Ellison. He said David had been acting on edge for months, and not just because of work. He thought Rebecca might be seeing someone, Mark confessed. He didn't want to believe it, but he started keeping track of her trips to the gym. Said she was always meeting some guy there. A trainer. Wallace's pulse quickened. Do you know his name? Mark paused. Daniel Ross. Used to have a record. Assault charges, a bar fight, something like that. But Rebecca swore he'd changed. The name rang in the detective's ears like a siren. When Wallace pulled Daniel Ross's record, the pieces began to fall into place. He had done time 6 years earlier for aggravated assault after attacking a man outside a nightclub. Since then, he'd kept a low profile, reinventing himself as a personal trainer for Atlanta's elite. His social media showed an expensive lifestyle, designer clothes, flashy cars, nights out, all inconsistent with his modest income. And then there was the car, a dark blue Lexus RCF. Detective Wallace exhaled slowly. There you are. She placed a call to the Brookhaven gym where Daniel worked. The manager confirmed that he trained Rebecca Miller privately twice a week, and had even visited her home for sessions. Wallace arranged to drop by unannounced. When she arrived at the gym the next morning, Daniel was in the middle of a session. He turned as she approached, his expression unreadable. He was tall, fit, and calm, too calm for someone who'd just learned a client's husband had been murdered. Mr. Ross, she said, flashing her badge. Detective Wallace, Brookhaven PD. I'd like to ask you a few questions about David Miller. His jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. Of course. Tragic news. I trained Rebecca, not him. What happened? That's what I'm trying to figure out, she said. Where were you Friday night? Daniel didn't flinch. Home. Alone. Watching a game. Anyone who can confirm that? No, he said evenly. But you can check my phone location if you'd like. Wallace studied him. His composure was almost too perfect, like someone who'd practiced this conversation in the mirror. Did you know David Miller personally? He smirked faintly. Only through Rebecca. Nice guy, from what I heard. But when she asked how long he'd known Rebecca, his confidence faltered for the first time. A few months. Maybe a year. Wallace leaned in slightly. And during that year, did the two of you get close? For a heartbeat, his eyes flickered. Then came the carefully measured reply, she's my client, detective. Nothing more. Later that night, Wallace replayed the interview in her head as she studied the case board in her office. Photographs of David's body, the Lexus headlights, and Rebecca's tear-streaked face stared back at her. Something was forming, a shape just beneath the surface. Then came the call that cracked the calm facade. One of the forensic techs had completed an analysis of tire impressions from the Miller driveway. They matched a high-performance tire used only on luxury sports models, including the Lexus RCF. And even more damning, traces of David's blood had been found inside a car abandoned behind an apartment complex 2 miles away. The plates were removed, but the VIN told the truth. It was registered to Daniel Ross. The next morning, Detective Wallace returned to Rebecca's home. Mrs. Miller, she said, stepping into the bright, sunlit kitchen where the smell of coffee lingered, we found your trainer's car. There's something you should know. Rebecca froze, her hand tightening on her mug. What are you talking about? Daniel Ross, Wallace said quietly. His car was found near the crime scene. And your husband's blood is inside it. The color drained from Rebecca's face. For the first time, the mask of composure slipped, and behind it was something darker. Something that told Wallace she was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a suspect. Detective Aaron Wallace sat across from Rebecca Miller in the soft hum of the interview room. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow across the steel table. Rebecca's hands were clasped together, her knuckles white, her wedding ring still on her finger, a ring that, by now, felt more like a lie than a symbol of love. Mrs. Miller, Wallace began, her voice calm but firm, your husband's blood was found in Daniel Ross's car. Can you explain how that's possible? Rebecca's eyes widened, and she let out a nervous laugh, a sound too sharp to be genuine. That's impossible, she said. Daniel had nothing to do with this. You must be mistaken. Wallace leaned forward, watching every micro-expression cross Rebecca's face. You've known Daniel for over a year. You see him regularly, often at your home. Your husband dies, and the man you spend most of your free time with just happens to have blood evidence in his vehicle? That's not coincidence, Mrs. Miller. That's connection. Rebecca looked down, trembling. Her mind raced for an answer, but silence betrayed her. Did you and Daniel have a relationship outside of training? Wallace pressed. Rebecca hesitated. We were friends, she finally whispered. Friends, Wallace repeated. Friends who called each other 28 times in the week before your husband's death. Rebecca froze. The detective placed printed phone records on the table. The calls were short but frequent, some just seconds long, others lasting minutes, almost all late at night. I want to help you, Wallace continued softly. But if you keep lying, I can't do that. Tell me the truth. What was going on between you and Daniel Ross? Rebecca's lip trembled. Her voice was a faint whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen. Tell me, Wallace urged. We started seeing each other, Rebecca said at last, tears spilling down her cheeks. It was a mistake. I was lonely, and Daniel was kind to me. But he didn't kill David. He couldn't have. Wallace let her speak, saying nothing. The silence between them grew heavy, almost suffocating. Rebecca wiped her tears with the back of her hand. David was never home. He cared more about his clients than his family. I just wanted someone to notice me again. That's all it was. The detective nodded slowly. And did Daniel know about your husband's life insurance policy? Rebecca's eyes snapped up. What? The $2 million policy David took out 6 months ago, Wallace said. You're the sole beneficiary. Rebecca's composure shattered. That has nothing to do with this. Wallace's voice hardened. It has everything to do with this. You were drowning in credit card debt, weren't you? Your accounts show over $80,000 owed. Daniel was behind on rent, 2 months late on his car payments. Together, you both had motive, and now, we have evidence. Rebecca's breathing quickened. You don't understand, she whispered, shaking her head. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Wallace leaned in. Then tell me how it was supposed to happen. Rebecca's voice dropped to a near whisper. Daniel said he'd scare him. That's all. He said he'd make him leave me. We were going to disappear after it was done. Detective Wallace exchanged a look with her partner, Officer Grant Myers, who had been silently taking notes. They'd heard variations of this story before, but this one was different. It wasn't just a lover's quarrel. It was a murder planned with precision and greed. Rebecca continued, her voice trembling. Daniel came up with the plan. He said he knew people who could make it look like a break-in. I begged him not to do anything stupid. But he said it was the only way for us to be free. Did you give him access to your house that night? Wallace asked. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. He already had a key. For the gym room. That was the confirmation Wallace needed. Did you talk to him after your husband's death? Rebecca's gaze shifted to the corner of the room, avoiding eye contact. No, she lied. Wallace slid another paper across the table, a phone record showing calls between Rebecca's burner number and Daniel's, made 2 days after the murder. Try again. Rebecca's hands shook. I didn't mean to call him. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. What did you two talk about? He told me to stay calm, she said. He said we had to act normal. That if I just played the grieving wife, the police would never suspect us. Wallace's jaw tightened. So he did admit he was involved. Rebecca looked up, tears streaming down her face. He said it was for us. That we could start over. He said once things settled down, we'd leave the state, use the money, and live somewhere no one would ever find us. That night, after Rebecca's partial confession, detectives obtained a warrant for Daniel Ross's arrest. But when they arrived at his apartment, he was gone. The unit was spotless, unnaturally so. The bed was made, the fridge empty, the closet half cleared. But tucked inside the kitchen trash can, among crumpled paper towels, was a small plastic GPS tracker smeared with dried dirt. When the forensics team analyzed it, they found traces of David Miller's blood. It had been attached under his car. Daniel had tracked every movement David made in the weeks leading up to the murder, waiting for the perfect night when he'd be alone. Detective Wallace called Rebecca back in. "We found the GPS device Daniel used to follow your husband," she said flatly. "You knew about it, didn't you?" Rebecca stared at the floor, silent. "Did you help him install it?" A single tear slid down her cheek. "Yes." There it was, the moment the line between witness and accomplice vanished. "You realize this means you're part of this crime," Wallace said quietly. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "But I helped the man who did." By dawn, the search for Daniel Ross had become a statewide manhunt. Detectives traced his phone's last ping to a highway rest stop heading south, toward Florida. His car was still missing, and the only clue left behind was a receipt for burner phones and a half-empty duffel bag filled with cash. Rebecca Miller was booked for conspiracy to commit murder. As she was led down the corridor in handcuffs, her sobs echoed off the walls. Somewhere on a dark highway, Daniel Ross was still free, convinced he had outsmarted everyone. But what he didn't know was that his arrogance had already betrayed him. Because less than 24 hours later, a single phone call, recorded by police, would bring everything crashing down. The rain was coming down hard that night, the kind that blurred the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. Detective Erin Wallace sat in her office, staring at the map on the wall, a red pin marking Brookhaven, another tracing a highway route toward Jacksonville, Florida. Daniel Ross was on the run, but not far enough. Every crime leaves a trail, and Wallace knew his ego would be his undoing. The evidence against him was overwhelming: blood in his car, a GPS tracker smeared with the victim's DNA, burner phone records connecting him to Rebecca. But what they didn't yet have was his voice, his own words tying him to the murder. That would change tonight. Detective Wallace and her team had spent hours persuading Rebecca Miller to cooperate. At first, she refused, terrified of what Daniel might do if he found out. But after seeing the reality of a murder charge and the weight of her guilt, she broke. "He thinks he's smarter than everyone," Rebecca said softly, sitting across from Wallace in the interview room. "He won't hide forever. He'll call me. He always does." Wallace nodded. "Then when he does, you'll answer. And we'll be listening." The plan was simple: use Rebecca to draw Daniel out. Her phone had been tapped with court authorization, and every word of their conversation would be recorded. Rebecca hesitated before agreeing, tears welling in her eyes. "He told me we'd start over," she whispered. "He said he loved me." Wallace's tone softened. "Maybe he did. But love doesn't look like this." The call came 3 nights later. Rebecca was sitting in her dimly lit living room, her hands trembling as she held the phone. Detectives waited in the surveillance van parked just down the street, headsets on, ready to record. At 9:42 p.m., the phone vibrated. The screen flashed with an unfamiliar number, one of the burners Daniel had bought. Rebecca took a deep breath and answered. "Hello? Becca." His voice was low, urgent, but strangely calm. "You okay?" Her breath caught. "Daniel, where are you?" Doesn't matter. You didn't say anything, did you? No, she whispered. But they came to my house. They found your car, Daniel. They know. Silence. Then, they can't prove anything. They've got nothing solid. Rebecca swallowed hard. They found David's blood. Another pause. I told you to clean everything, he hissed. I did what I could, she said, letting her voice tremble. They think I planned it with you. They think we did it together. You just keep quiet, Daniel said firmly. We'll be fine. I've got money stashed. I'll come for you soon. We can still get out of this. Daniel, they said they traced your phone to Florida. A faint laugh. Let them look. They'll never find me. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Why did you do it? She whispered. You said you were only going to scare him. Another long pause. Then, almost too quiet to hear, he wouldn't stop fighting. I didn't have a choice. In the van, Detective Wallace straightened up, signaling to her team. There it is. Rebecca's hand shook. You killed him, she said softly, the words catching in her throat. Daniel sighed. I did it for us. You know that. Everything we dreamed about, the money, the house, freedom, it's all waiting. Don't turn on me now, Becca. Not after everything. Her tears fell silently. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Don't you dare, Daniel snapped. You think they'll let you walk? You're in this as deep as I am. You told me when he'd be home. You gave me the key. Rebecca's heart pounded. Please, Daniel. Just stop. But he wasn't finished. I did what I had to do. Now you're going to keep your mouth shut, and when the heat dies down, I'll call again. Then we'll disappear, just like we planned. The line went dead. Rebecca collapsed into sobs. Outside, in the van, Detective Wallace removed her headset and exchanged a grim look with her partner. We got him, she said quietly. Within hours, arrest warrants were issued for first-degree murder and conspiracy. But finding Daniel Ross would be another challenge. 2 days later, a highway patrol unit in southern Georgia spotted a dark blue Lexus parked behind an abandoned rest stop. The engine was cold, and the plates were gone. Inside the trunk, officers found a duffel bag containing $8,000 in cash, a fake ID, and a loaded handgun. But Daniel wasn't there. He'd fled on foot through the nearby woods, leaving behind muddy footprints and tire tracks, a trail that stretched toward a rural motel 3 miles away. By dawn, U.S. Marshals and local officers had surrounded the area. When they finally kicked open the door to room 12 of the Peach Blossom Motel, Daniel Ross was sitting at a small table, head down, staring at a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He didn't resist. Detective Wallace, he muttered as she entered. Took you long enough. She met his cold, defiant eyes. You've been busy, Daniel. He smirked. Guess I'm famous now. You're a murderer, she corrected. He leaned back in his chair. Funny. She told me she'd never talk. She didn't have to, Wallace said, pulling a small recorder from her pocket. You did. For a moment, Daniel's expression froze, the first real crack in his armor. You made a mistake, Wallace said. You called her. You confessed. And now, everything you built, the lies, the plans, the fantasy, it's over. He exhaled slowly, then looked out the window at the flashing red and blue lights. Guess I should have just left her behind, he muttered. She said the same thing about you, Wallace replied. By morning, the news spread across Atlanta, personal trainer and married woman arrested for husband's murder. The community that once admired the Millers was stunned. Behind every closed door, whispers grew, about the affair, the greed, the lies that had turned a picture-perfect family into a nightmare. Rebecca and Daniel were now both behind bars, facing the same charge, murder in the first degree. But for Detective Wallace, the case wasn't finished. There were still details to uncover: the hidden messages, the insurance transfers, the final days leading up to the killing. Because beneath the passion and betrayal lay something even colder, a blueprint for murder, written by two people who thought they could control everything, including each other. And as Wallace reviewed the evidence one last time, she knew that in the courtroom, their love story would unravel piece by piece. Spring returned to Atlanta, but for Rebecca Miller and Daniel Ross, the changing seasons meant nothing. They sat on opposite sides of the Fulton County Courthouse, their former affection replaced by tension and silence. Once lovers who whispered promises in the dark, now they wouldn't even look at each other. Detective Aaron Wallace stood near the back of the courtroom on the opening day of the trial. Months of relentless work had led to this: thousands of pages of evidence, hours of phone calls, and confessions that would soon be played before a jury. It wasn't just another case for her, it was a portrait of betrayal so deep it had destroyed not just one family, but an entire community's sense of trust. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, cameras waited outside. Every headline carried the same chilling tagline: the affair that turned deadly. At 9 a.m., the proceedings began. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Claire Henson, opened with a quiet but devastating statement. David Miller was a devoted father, a successful man, and a husband who trusted the woman sitting before you, she began, her voice calm yet sharp. On a warm night last April, that trust was repaid with betrayal and blood. His wife and her lover plotted his death, believing they could start a new life funded by a $2 million insurance policy. But greed always leaves footprints. And those footprints lead straight to the defendants. The jurors listened in silence as she described the cold precision of the murder: the GPS tracker placed on David's car, the burner phones used to coordinate, the fake alibi Rebecca built around a weekend family trip. When Henson played the recording of Daniel's phone call to Rebecca, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. His voice, once confident, now damning, filled the room. He wouldn't stop fighting. "I didn't have a choice." Rebecca buried her face in her hands. Daniel sat still, his jaw tight, pretending the words weren't his. The defense tried to tear the story apart. Daniel's attorney argued that the recording had been manipulated, that the police had coerced Rebecca into setting a trap. He claimed Daniel acted out of fear, that David had attacked him first during a confrontation about the affair. "He never meant for it to go that far," the attorney said. "It was self-defense, not murder." But the evidence painted a different picture. Forensics confirmed that David had been ambushed, stabbed from behind with no defensive wounds. The blood spatter told a story of control, not chaos. And when the prosecution revealed the insurance documents showing Rebecca as the sole beneficiary, her motives became impossible to deny. Detective Wallace took the stand on the third day. Her testimony was clear, methodical, and devastating. She recounted how she'd first suspected the crime wasn't a robbery, how every clue, the untouched valuables, the blood patterns, the tire tracks, pointed to an inside job. She described the moment she discovered the Lexus, the GPS device, and the voice recording that broke the case open. When asked about Rebecca's cooperation, Wallace didn't soften her words. "She admitted to helping plan the timing," Wallace said, her voice steady. "She provided the schedule, the house key, and details about her husband's routine. She may not have held the knife, but she helped sharpen it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rebecca's attorney fought to portray her as a victim, manipulated by a violent man she feared. She was vulnerable, trapped in a toxic affair with a man who controlled her emotionally and physically, the defense argued. She never wanted her husband dead. She was used. Rebecca cried on the stand, her voice trembling. "He told me it would just be a scare. He said David would back off, that no one would get hurt. I didn't know he'd kill him. I swear I didn't." When asked why she didn't come forward after the murder, she hesitated. "Because I loved him," she whispered. The jury watched, unmoved. Then came Daniel's turn to testify, against his lawyer's advice. He smirked as he took the stand, wearing the same confidence that once charmed Rebecca. "She's lying," he said flatly. "She planned everything. I was just the one who did what she couldn't." He leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "She hated her husband. Told me every detail of his schedule. Said she couldn't stand the sight of him. Said she wanted him gone." Rebecca shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "That's not true," she cried. But Daniel kept going, his tone growing colder with each word. "She knew exactly what would happen. The insurance. The timing. Even the part where she'd play the grieving widow." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Daniel smiled faintly, knowing he'd dragged her down with him. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. "This was no crime of passion," Ada Henson said, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "This was a calculated execution. 2 people, bound by lust and greed, conspired to murder a man who trusted them both. They thought they could outsmart justice. They were wrong." The defense countered with one final plea for sympathy, painting Rebecca as emotionally fragile and Daniel as reckless, impulsive. But by then, the jury had seen enough. After 11 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Daniel Ross, guilty. Daniel's expression didn't change. He only stared forward, as if the word had no meaning. Moments later, the second verdict came. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Rebecca Miller, guilty. Her body crumpled, a quiet sob escaping as she covered her face with trembling hands. At sentencing, Judge Harper's words cut like a blade. "You turned love into a weapon. You conspired to take a man's life for profit and passion. This court has no tolerance for such cruelty." Daniel Ross received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Miller received life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Neither spoke as they were led from the courtroom, 2 ghosts bound by the same darkness that once brought them together. Outside, the media swarmed. Headlines blared the story of "The Fitness Trainer Killer" and "The Widow Who Lied." Detective Wallace watched from the courthouse steps, rain beginning to fall once more. She'd seen countless cases of greed and betrayal, but something about this one lingered, the image of 2 people who had everything, yet chose to destroy it all for money and deceit. As she turned to leave, she glanced at the courthouse doors one last time. Justice had been served, but no one had truly won. The story didn't end with the verdict. It never really does. Months had passed since the trial that shook Brookhaven, but the echoes of the Miller case still rippled quietly through the city. The Miller home, once filled with laughter and light, now stood empty, its "for sale" sign swaying gently in the Georgia breeze. Neighbors who once admired the family avoided looking at it when they passed by. The manicured lawn, the white shutters, the children's swing in the backyard, all of it had become a reminder of what greed can destroy. Inside the small courtroom archives downtown, Detective Aaron Wallace closed the thick case file labeled State vs. Miller and Ross. It was done. The evidence, the photos, the phone transcripts, all sealed now. But the case stayed with her. She had seen many tragedies in her career, but this one carried a particular weight, because it wasn't about strangers, or enemies. It was about 2 people who claimed to love each other, and killed for it. In prison, Daniel Ross adjusted quickly. He worked out daily, charmed a few guards, and carried himself with the same swagger that once made him magnetic. But there was no one left to impress, and his charm had nowhere to go. Inmates called him "Trainer," a name that made him smirk, though sometimes late at night, when the noise of the cell block died down, he would stare at the concrete ceiling and replay those final moments in the backyard. He told himself he'd done it for love, but he knew the truth. He'd done it because he thought he could win. Rebecca, housed in a women's correctional facility 2 counties away, lived a very different existence. Gone was the poised real estate agent who once smiled for charity galas and church events. Her days were quiet now, reading, working in the prison kitchen, counting time in silence. The other inmates called her the widow, and she rarely spoke unless spoken to. Once a week, she received letters from her children, carefully written by her sister, who was now raising them. Emily was 12, Ryan 9. They never mentioned their father. They never mentioned her. Just short updates about school, drawings in crayon, and the occasional, "Love you, Mom." Those letters were both her punishment and her only comfort. The insurance money, once the foundation of her deadly dream, had been seized by the court. The funds were placed in a trust for the children, protected from the greed that had taken their father's life. At night, Rebecca often thought about David, his easy smile, his gentle voice when he read to their kids, the smell of his aftershave in the hallway. She had convinced herself for months that she'd fallen out of love with him, that their marriage was dead. But sitting alone in a cell, she realized the truth she'd tried so hard to bury: David hadn't been perfect, but he hadn't deserved to die for it. The realization came too late. Detective Wallace received a letter from Rebecca nearly a year after the sentencing. It was handwritten, neat, and brief. Detective Wallace. You were right. I thought I could control everything, him, the plan, my life. I thought I was smarter than the truth. But the truth always wins. I don't ask for forgiveness, only that my children never see me as what I became. Tell them their father was a good man. And tell them I remember every day. Rebecca Miller. Wallace folded the letter and tucked it into the file. She didn't reply. Some stories didn't need more words. The years moved on. The Miller children grew up away from Brookhaven, shielded from the media and whispers that followed their family's name. The community tried to heal, though the case left a scar that never quite faded. At neighborhood gatherings, people still lowered their voices when passing the subject, a quiet reminder that even the most beautiful homes can hold the darkest secrets. Sometimes, when the evening air grew still and the streetlights flickered on, an older neighbor would glance toward the now-occupied Miller house and murmur, "That's where it happened." And every time, those words carried the same quiet chill. For Detective Wallace, the case became one she'd never forget, not for the brutality of the crime, but for the fragility of the people behind it. 2 ordinary individuals who mistook obsession for love, and love for ownership. She had once described the Miller's story in her notes as a murder built on illusion. And as she looked out over the city skyline one last time before closing the file for good, she understood that illusion was what destroyed them all, the illusion of control, of happiness, of safety. Because love, when mixed with greed, doesn't heal. It consumes. In the end, there were no winners. Just a man whose life was stolen, a woman who traded love for loss, a lover who thought he could outrun guilt, and 2 children who would grow up learning what betrayal truly costs. The case of David Miller became more than just a headline, it became a warning. A haunting reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous place isn't a dark alley or a stranger's shadow. It's the heart of someone you trust. Love built on lies is never love at all. In Brookhaven, Georgia, it began as an affair, and ended as a tragedy that proved one truth no one can escape: greed can turn affection into a weapon, and the person you love most can be the one who ends you.